A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Most of the time, when we hear the word Canaanite, it is coming from a very specific context. Usually, it is the Sunday school version, where they are the formidable, slightly mysterious villains of the Old Testament that the Israelites had to overcome to enter the Promised Land. But if you actually strip away the Sunday school felt boards and look at the archaeology, you find a civilization that basically invented the modern world's operating system. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the ancient Canaanites, and he is asking us to dig into who they actually were beyond the biblical tropes.
It is a massive topic because we are talking about the primary indigenous culture of the Levant. Everything from modern Israel and Palestine to Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And Corn, you are spot on about the operating system. We're talking about the people who gave us the alphabet. Not the Greeks, not the Romans, but the Canaanites. By the way, before we get too deep into the Bronze Age, I should mention that today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It is helping us parse through thousands of years of Levantine history.
It is funny because we usually credit the Phoenicians with the alphabet, but the Phoenicians were just the Iron Age rebranding of the Canaanites. It is like the difference between a startup and the massive conglomerate it becomes. But I want to start with the identity crisis. Were the Canaanites actually a single people? Because when I look at the map of the ancient Near East, it looks less like a country and more like a collection of very intense city-states that spent as much time fighting each other as they did trading with Egypt.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to tell you, the term Canaanite is almost more of a linguistic and geographic umbrella than a strict ethnic one. In the Bronze Age, from roughly 2000 to 1200 BCE, you did not have a king of Canaan. You had the king of Ugarit, the king of Hazor, the king of Byblos. These were independent, highly sophisticated urban hubs. What tied them together was a shared language group, Canaanite, and a shared material culture. If you walked into a house in Megiddo or a house in Sidon in 1500 BCE, the pottery, the layout, and the religious figurines would look remarkably similar.
So it is more like saying someone is European or Scandinavian today. You have shared traits, but a guy in Tyre might not have felt much kinship with a guy in Jericho if their kings were at each other's throats over trade routes. And speaking of trade, that seems to be the engine behind everything they did. They were the ultimate middlemen of the ancient world, stuck right between the superpowers of Egypt and Mesopotamia.
That geographic position is precisely why they became the innovators they were. If you are a merchant in a Canaanite port city like Ugarit, you are dealing with Egyptian hieroglyphs which are beautiful but incredibly complex with hundreds of signs. On the other side, you have Akkadian cuneiform which involves pressing the stylus into clay to make hundreds of different wedge shapes. It is a nightmare for a busy trader who just wants to keep track of how many jars of olive oil he sent to Memphis.
Necessity is the mother of invention, right? If the existing systems are too bloated for a fast-moving economy, you build a leaner one. Is that where Proto-Sinaitic comes in? I have always found that transition fascinating. The moment someone realized they didn't need a picture for an entire word, just a sign for a sound.
It is one of the most significant pivots in human history. Around 1850 BCE, we see these inscriptions in the Sinai Peninsula. Canaanite miners or laborers working for the Egyptians saw the hieroglyphs and essentially hacked them. They took the Egyptian symbol for a house, which the Egyptians called Pur, but the Canaanites called a house Bet. They decided that the symbol for a house would now just represent the B sound. Suddenly, instead of memorizing 1,000 characters, you only need about 22.
It is the first instance of data compression for literacy. You move from a system where only the elite scribes can read and write to a system where, theoretically, anyone could learn it in a few days. That is a massive democratization of information, even if it took a few centuries to really catch on. But Herman, why did it happen there specifically? Why didn't the Egyptians or the Hittites simplify their systems first?
Because those empires were invested in the complexity. Scribes were a protected class. In the Canaanite city-states, the power structure was different. It was more mercantile. Efficiency was more valuable than tradition. And when you look at the Ugaritic texts from around 1200 BCE, found at Ras Shamra in modern Syria, you see this in action. They actually used a version of the alphabet, but written in cuneiform. They were experimenting with the medium while keeping the alphabetic message. It shows these cities were intellectual laboratories.
I love the idea of ancient Ugarit as a Bronze Age Silicon Valley, but let's talk about the culture itself. When people think of Canaanite religion, they usually think of the bad things mentioned in the Bible, Baal worship, high places, and the like. But what did their actual spiritual life look like? It seems like a very crowded pantheon.
It was incredibly rich and, frankly, it is the foundation for a lot of what comes later in Western monotheism. At the top you had El. He was the creator god, the father of years, often depicted as a wise, bearded old man sitting on a throne. Sound familiar? His consort was Asherah. Then you have the younger, more active gods like Baal, the storm god who brings the rain for the crops. The Canaanite myths, especially the Baal cycle found at Ugarit, are these epic dramas about the struggle between order and chaos, life and death.
And there was a lot of syncretism, right? They weren't exactly pure in their practice. They were sponges for the cultures around them. If an Egyptian merchant brings a statue of Hathor, the Canaanites are like, cool. She looks a lot like our Astarte. Let's just merge them. It feels very pragmatic.
It was. And this is where the political reality gets interesting. For much of the Late Bronze Age, Canaan was essentially an Egyptian province, or at least under heavy Egyptian influence. The Amarna letters, which are these clay tablets from the 14th century BCE, show Canaanite kings writing to the pharaoh, begging for troops or complaining about their neighbors. They are all jostling for position. It was a fragmented, competitive landscape.
Which makes the biblical narrative of a unified conquest so interesting to look at through an archaeological lens. If you read the book of Joshua, it is this blitzkrieg. The walls of Jericho fall, the cities are burned, and the Canaanites are wiped out. But when archaeologists actually dig up these sites, the story on the ground is, well, it is complicated.
Complicated is an understatement. If you look at Jericho, for example, the famous destruction layer that people used to associate with Joshua actually dates to around 1550 BCE. That is at least 200 years before most scholars place the Israelite arrival. Most of the evidence points to an earthquake or an Egyptian campaign. When the Israelites would have been showing up, Jericho was barely a village, if it was inhabited at all.
So the walls falling down might be a cultural memory of a much older event, or a literary way of describing a transition that was actually much slower and more internal. I have seen research suggesting that the early Israelites weren't actually invaders from the outside, but were themselves displaced or rural Canaanites who moved into the highlands and started a new cultural identity.
That is the prevailing view in modern archaeology. It is called the internal emergence model. The idea is that as the great Bronze Age empires collapsed around 1200 BCE, the so-called Bronze Age collapse, the Canaanite city-state system fell apart. Trade stopped, the cities were raided by the sea peoples, and the social order dissolved. The people we call Israelites were likely a mix of local Canaanite peasants, nomadic groups, and perhaps some runaway slaves from Egypt who coalesced in the hills. Their pottery is almost identical to Canaanite pottery. Their language is a dialect of Canaanite.
So it wasn't an ethnic replacement, it was a social and religious revolution. They kept the language and the tech like the alphabet, but they changed the brand. They moved away from the polytheistic urban system of the coast and toward a more egalitarian, monotheistic system in the mountains. But what happened to the Canaanites who stayed on the coast? They didn't just vanish.
Not at all. They became the Phoenicians. The Greeks called them Phoenicians because of the phoenix or purple dye they produced from murex snails, but they called themselves Canaani. They are the ones who took that Canaanite alphabet, refined it, and sailed it all over the Mediterranean. They founded Carthage, they traded with Spain, they reached Cornwall. When we use the Latin alphabet today, we are using a descendant of the script developed by Canaanite merchants 3,500 years ago.
It is amazing how much of our history is a game of telephone. We look at the Romans, who looked at the Greeks, who looked at the Phoenicians, who were really just Canaanites with better boats. But I want to go back to the idea of erasure, because there is this persistent myth that the Canaanites were totally destroyed or driven out. But recently, there's been some pretty definitive DNA evidence that says otherwise.
Yeah, this is where the science gets really cool. There was a major study published in the journal Nature in 2020. Researchers sequenced the genomes of skeletons from Bronze Age Canaanite sites and compared them to modern populations. They found that modern-day Lebanese people, as well as many Palestinians and Jews, derive a huge percentage of their ancestry, up to 90% in some cases, directly from those Bronze Age Canaanites.
90%? That is incredible. So the annihilation described in ancient texts was more of a theological statement than a genetic reality. The people stayed, the culture just shifted. It really challenges the way we think about indigeneity and land. If the descendants of the villains and the heroes of the Bible are actually the same people genetically, it reframes the whole historical narrative of the Levant.
It makes the modern obsession with who was here first feel a bit reductive because the answer is almost always everyone's ancestors. The Canaanites are the root system. Whether you are looking at the development of Judaism, the expansion of maritime trade, or the very letters we are using to write this script, you find Canaanite DNA both literal and metaphorical.
I think that is a perfect place to transition into the deeper mechanics of how these city-states actually functioned. Because if they weren't a unified empire, how did they maintain such a consistent culture for nearly 2,000 years? Was it just trade, or was there something deeper in their social structure?
It was a combination of things, but the palace economy was the heart of it. In cities like Hazor or Megiddo, everything revolved around the king's palace and the temple. They were the central clearinghouses for resources. Farmers would bring their grain and oil, and the palace would redistribute it or trade it for luxury goods from Egypt or Mesopotamia. This created a very hierarchical but stable society. However, it was also fragile. If the trade routes were cut, the whole system collapsed.
Which is exactly what happened during the Bronze Age collapse. It is like a global supply chain failure. If the ships stop coming from Cyprus with copper, and the caravans stop coming from the east with tin, you can't make bronze. And if you can't make bronze, you can't make tools or weapons. The Canaanite cities, because they were so sophisticated and interconnected, were actually the most vulnerable when the world went dark.
That is such a keen point. Complexity is a vulnerability. The Sea Peoples. These mysterious marauders from the Aegean didn't need a complex economy, they just needed to raid. They hit the coastal cities of Canaan hard. Some cities, like Ugarit, were destroyed and never rebuilt. It is a stark reminder that being the most advanced civilization doesn't always mean you are the most resilient.
It is the fragility of the elite problem. The people in the hills, the ones who would become the Israelites, were resilient precisely because they were less dependent on that international trade network. They were subsistence farmers. They didn't need tin from the Hindu Kush to survive.
And yet, they kept the most important piece of Canaanite tech, the alphabet. It is the ultimate portable culture. You can burn a palace, you can steal the gold, but you can't uninvent a writing system that is already in the heads of the survivors.
Let's talk more about that alphabet hieroglyph transition, because I don't think people realize how radical it was. In Egypt, writing was a sacred priestly act. The word hieroglyph literally means sacred carving. By turning it into an alphabet, the Canaanites secularized it. They took it out of the temple and put it in the marketplace.
You see that in the names of the letters. Aleph means ox, Bet means house, Gimel means camel. These are everyday objects. It wasn't about gods or pharaohs, it was about stuff you could touch. And because it was phonetic, it could be adapted to any language. When the Greeks got a hold of it, they just added vowels. When the Romans got it, they squared off the letters. But the A you see on a billboard today is still, at its core, an upside-down Canaanite ox head.
I'm never going to look at a bowl of alphabets the same way again. It's just a bowl of tiny Canaanite oxen and houses. But beyond the alphabet, what about their engineering? I've read about the water systems in places like Hazor and Megiddo. These weren't just mud huts, these were sophisticated urban environments.
Oh, the water engineering was incredible. In Hazor, they dug a massive shaft 45 meters deep through solid rock to reach the water table so they could survive a siege. They had drainage systems, multi-story buildings, and massive fortifications. At Tel Dan, there is a mud brick gate from the 18th century BCE that is still standing with its original arch. This is centuries before the Romans supposedly perfected the arch. The Canaanites were master builders.
And yet, we call them primitive or pagan because that is how they were framed by the writers who came after them. It is a classic case of the winners writing the history, except in this case, the winners were actually the descendants who just wanted to distance themselves from the old ways. It's like a teenager moving out and complaining about how lame their parents' house is, while they're wearing their parents' clothes and using their parents' car.
That is exactly what it is. The biblical polemics against Canaanite religion were so fierce precisely because the two cultures were so similar. You don't have to tell people not to worship the gods of the Aztecs if they've never met an Aztec. You have to tell them not to worship Baal because Baal is right there, in the next village, and he looks a lot like your own god. The struggle for an Israelite identity was a struggle to differentiate themselves from their Canaanite roots.
It's the narcissism of small differences. You have to make the other look monstrous, so you don't realize you're looking in a mirror. But let's look at the archaeological reality of their monstrous practices. One of the biggest charges against the Canaanites was child sacrifice. For a long time, scholars thought this was just propaganda. But then they found the Tophets in Carthage and some evidence in the Levant. What's the current consensus on that?
It is one of the most debated topics in Near Eastern archaeology. In Carthage, which was a Phoenician Canaanite colony, there is very strong evidence of infant sacrifice in times of extreme crisis. In the Levant itself, the evidence is much thinner. We find infant burials under the floors of houses, but that was often a way of keeping a child who died of natural causes close to the family, a common practice in many ancient cultures. Most archaeologists today think that while it may have happened in rare, extreme circumstances, the biblical description of it being a routine, widespread practice was likely an exaggeration to justify the conquest narrative.
It's the ancient equivalent of yellow journalism. You take a kernel of truth or a rare occurrence and turn it into the defining characteristic of your enemy. It makes the fierce people Daniel mentioned in the prompts seem more like a trope than a demographic reality.
Right. And you have to look at the context of the Levant. It was a violent place, but not because the Canaanites were uniquely fierce. It was because everyone wanted that land. The Hittites from the north, the Egyptians from the south, the Assyrians from the east. The Canaanites were constantly being squeezed. Their fierceness was a survival mechanism. If you weren't tough, you didn't last a week in the Bronze Age Levant.
So if I were to travel back to, say, 1400 BCE and walk into a Canaanite city like Byblos, what would I actually see? Is it a bustling cosmopolitan port?
You would be blown away. You'd see ships from Crete and Cyprus unloading copper and pottery. You'd see Egyptian officials in linen robes negotiating with local merchants. You'd smell cedar wood from the mountains being prepared for export. The cedars of Lebanon were the most prized timber in the ancient world. You'd hear a dozen different languages in the market, but most people would be using that simplified script to keep their tallies. It would feel surprisingly modern, a globalized, trade-obsessed, multi-ethnic urban center.
It sounds like a Bronze Age Dubai or Singapore, a place where the business of the world gets done. And that brings up a really interesting point about cultural resilience. Even when the cities were destroyed, the Canaaniteness survived because it was tied to the land and the trade routes. It didn't need a central government to exist.
And that is why the DNA evidence is so important. It proves that the Canaanites didn't go anywhere. They are the bedrock of the region. The cultural layers on top, the Israelites, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Crusaders. They are all just additions to a house that was built by Canaanites.
This really changes the way we should look at history. Instead of seeing it as a series of replacements where one group wipes out another, it is more like a sourdough starter. Each new group adds some flour and water, but the original yeast, the Canaanite core, is still in there, making the whole thing rise.
I love that. The Canaanite yeast of the Levant. And it's not just in the Levant. Because they were the ones who spread the alphabet, that yeast is in every book ever written in the Western world. Every time you write a letter, you are performing a Canaanite ritual.
So, let's talk about the takeaways for today. If someone is listening to this and wondering why they should care about a bunch of Bronze Age merchants, what is the so what?
The first big takeaway is a lesson in critical thinking regarding historical narratives. We often accept official histories, whether they are religious texts or national myths, at face value. But archaeology and genetics often tell a much more nuanced story. The Canaanite story shows us that the villains of history are often just the people whose story was told by someone else. When we look at the evidence, we see innovators, master builders, and the ancestors of modern populations, not just fierce enemies.
Right, and it's a reminder to look for the operating system of a culture. We get distracted by the fancy temples or the big wars, but the real legacy of a civilization is often the boring, practical stuff they leave behind, like a simpler way to keep track of inventory. The alphabet is the most successful technology in human history. It hasn't been disrupted in 3,000 years. That tells you something about the value of simplicity and accessibility.
Another takeaway is about cultural continuity. We tend to think of history as a series of hard breaks. This empire fell, that one rose. But human beings are remarkably resilient. Governments fail, cities burn, but people and their core cultural traits persist. The fact that 90% of Lebanese DNA comes from Bronze Age Canaanites is a powerful testament to the fact that people are more permanent than states.
It also suggests that diversity is a driver of innovation. The Canaanites weren't a monolith. They were a messy, competitive, trade-connected cluster of different groups. And it was that very messiness, the need to communicate across boundaries, that led to the invention of the alphabet. If they had been a single closed empire, they probably would have just stuck with the complex system they already had.
That is a great point for the modern world. Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens at the crossroads. If you want to see the future, don't look at the center of the empire. Look at the places where different cultures are bumping into each other and trying to figure out how to do business.
So, what can people actually do if they want to dive deeper into this? Because I feel like we've just scratched the surface of the tell, so to speak.
There are some amazing resources out there. I'd recommend checking out the Ancient Near East Digital Library, the ANED. They have a ton of primary sources, including translations of the Ugaritic texts. If you want to see what Canaanite literature actually looked like, reading the Ball Cycle is wild. It's like Game of Thrones meets the Odyssey, but written 1,200 years before Homer.
And if you're ever in the Levant, go to the sites. Go to Megiddo, go to Hazor, go to Byblos. Standing in a mud brick gate that was built 4,000 years ago and realizing that the people who built it are essentially the same people living in the town down the road. That is a perspective shift you can't get from a book.
It really is. It grounds you in the long arc of history. It reminds you that we are all just temporary tenants in a very old house.
Well, I think we've done Daniel's prompt justice. We've gone from Sunday school villains to Bronze Age tech disruptors. It's a hell of a journey for one group of people.
And we didn't even mention the purple snails that much.
Saving the snails for another time. Before we wrap up, I want to say thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. They make the complex processing of these scripts possible. This has been my Weird Prompts.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Bronze Age, leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other curious minds find the show.
We will be back next time with whatever weird prompt Daniel sends our way. Until then, keep digging.
See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth.